October 2004. Under the blazing lights of Yankee Stadium, the name Curt Schilling wasn't just a pitcher getting ready to throw. He was one of the greatest warriors baseball has ever produced. Before that fateful night, Schilling had built a career many pitchers could only dream of. He was a six-time Major League Baseball All-Star, one of the pitchers with the best strikeout-to-walk ratio in history, and he had recorded more than 3,000 strikeouts in his career, a milestone reached only by the very best pitchers. In 1993, he was the MVP of the National League Championship Series when he led the Philadelphia Phillies to the World Series. By 2001, in Arizona Diamondbacks colors, Schilling and Randy Johnson formed one of the most feared pitching duos in history, defeating the New York Yankees in the World Series and sharing World Series MVP honors. 3 years later, he became a hero for the Boston Red Sox in their quest to break the curse of the Bambino, the curse that had haunted the team for 86 years. With the famous bloody sock in the 2004 ALCS and his key role in that year's World Series championship, Schilling didn't just win, he etched his name into one of the most legendary stories in American sports. When the Red Sox won again in 2007, he completed a career many called the perfect definition of a postseason warrior. But titles, trophies, and impressive stats only tell a very small part of Curt Schilling's story, because behind those victories was a man long accustomed to pain. Long before his sock was soaked in blood in front of millions of viewers. That October night in 2004 at Yankee Stadium, Curt Schilling stepped onto the mound with an ankle tendon that had been stitched up just hours earlier. Doctors had warned that if the tendon tore completely, his career could end right there. But Schilling still chose to take the mound. His first pitches left his hand in the tense silence of the stadium. Then blood began seeping through his white sock, red drops spreading with every step. Television cameras zoomed in on the blood, and the entire country watched a pitcher throw in pain that was almost unbearable. Every pitch was him fighting against a body screaming to stop. But Curt Schilling didn't stop. Because for him, baseball was never just a game. It was a battle of pride, of will, and of the belief that a person can push beyond their own limits. The bloody sock that night wasn't just a sports image. It was a symbol of a truth Curt Schilling had lived his whole life. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't beating an opponent, but refusing to surrender to pain. If Curt Schilling's story makes you feel the power of will and resilience, hit subscribe so we can explore the next chapters of his eventful life together. Curt Schilling was born in 1966 in Anchorage, Alaska, in a family where the shadow of war still quietly covered every corner of life. His father, Cliff Schilling, was a veteran who served in the Vietnam War. He came home from the war not just with medals and memories, but with invisible wounds that many American veterans of that era carried for the rest of their lives. In the Schilling household, military discipline wasn't a distant concept. It was a way of life, a way of speaking, a way a father taught his son to become a man. Cliff Schilling was a strict father who believed the world had no room for weakness. There were many hugs in the house, not many words of praise, rarely any long conversations about feelings. What Curt saw every day was the hard silence of a man who had been through war and learned to keep everything inside. The Schilling family moved many times when Curt was young because the life of a military family rarely stayed stable in one place. The constant moves made young Curt always feel like an outsider, everywhere. New schools, new friends, new neighborhoods where he had to start over from scratch. But in his own home, he knew one thing clearly: weakness wasn't an option. Curt grew up in an environment where failure wasn't easily accepted. If he made a mistake, he had to fix it. If he fell, he had to get up without complaining. That wasn't his father's cruelty. It was how a veteran believed his son needed to be prepared for the harsh world outside. But for a child, those lessons sometimes came too soon. Curt learned to keep quiet about his fears. He learned to hide the times he felt lost, and he learned to fight alone because that was the only way he knew to survive in his world. While other kids found comfort in family, Curt often looked for it somewhere else. For him, that place was a small baseball field with faded white lines and an old glove. Baseball entered Curt Schilling's life not as a big dream at first. It was simply a place where he could breathe. On the field, the rules of the world became clearer. If you threw well, it went where it should. If you practiced hard, you got better. No confusing emotions. No unanswered questions. Just the pitcher, the hitter, and the distance between them. Curt started spending hours on the field, throwing against a wall, picking up the ball, and throwing again. Over and over. Those were rare moments when he felt he had control over something in his life. Every pitch was a small affirmation that he could be stronger than yesterday, and gradually, baseball stopped being just an escape. It became the language Curt used to speak to the world. A boy raised in the silence of a disciplined family began finding his voice on the mound. But even as Curt's talent started to show, the road ahead was never easy. No one said he would become a star. No scout stood outside the field, taking notes on his throws. In many people's eyes, Curt Schilling was just an ordinary boy from an ordinary family, growing up in the shadow of a war he hadn't even lived through. But it was that harsh environment that created something few noticed at the time. It created a man who would never easily surrender. The years of living under military discipline, in emotional silence, under pressure to be strong, taught Curt a lesson the baseball world would later witness. Sometimes a person's greatest strength isn't talent, but the ability to endure. And when Curt Schilling stood on the mound many years later, throwing decisive pitches in front of tens of thousands, few knew that behind each throw was the memory of a boy who learned to hide pain and fight alone. Baseball gave Curt Schilling a path, but his harsh childhood created the warrior strong enough to walk it. Unlike many baseball legends, those talked about since high school as prodigies, courted by big universities, and featured on sports magazine covers, Curt Schilling entered the baseball world almost in silence. No spotlight, no praising articles, no prestigious scholarships from famous colleges. His path began in a place few dreamed would be a stepping stone to the major leagues, Yavapai Junior College, a small community college in Arizona. There, Curt wasn't a star. He was just a tall, skinny pitcher who threw fairly hard but was still raw, lacking control and unpolished technique. Scouts who occasionally stopped by the practice field usually stayed only a few minutes before leaving, their eyes lingering on more standout talents. Curt knew that look very well, the look of people evaluating a player and deciding he wasn't the future of the sport. When the Boston Red Sox drafted Curt Schilling in 1986 in the second round, that should have been the life-changing moment. But to many scouts in the Major League Baseball system, it was just a gamble. Quite a few said outright that Curt Schilling wasn't a pitcher who could last in the major leagues. Some thought his delivery lacked consistency. Others said he didn't have the finesse needed to be an elite pitcher. Some even said he might spend his whole career in the minors. Those comments weren't said directly to Curt, but in the baseball world, rumors spread faster than any fastball. And Curt heard them. The early years after being drafted weren't the dream many imagined. Instead of big stadiums and packed crowds, Curt Schilling entered the world of the minor leagues, where baseball exists in corners few people see. Long bus rides through dark rural American roads, small fields with stands holding only a few hundred people, cramped locker rooms where young players shared fragile hopes of a future no one was sure would come. Pay was meager. Many players had to take winter jobs to make ends meet. Curt was no exception. There were weeks when the money he got barely covered food and rent. But the hardest thing wasn't the money. The hardest thing was the doubt. In the minors, every player knows only a tiny fraction will reach the major leagues. The rest vanish from the baseball map without anyone remembering their names. Curt began feeling that harsh truth every day. Every time a teammate was released, every time a friend on the team left because there were no more chances, every time a scout came to watch a game but didn't write a single note about his pitches. There were nights Curt lay in cheap motel beds, staring at the ceiling and wondering if his dream was a mistake. If he was chasing something the world had already decided he wasn't good enough for. But it was in those anonymous years that something began forming inside Curt Schilling. Not fame, not recognition, but a quiet toughness. He started throwing more, practicing longer, staying at the field after the other players had left. Curt understood that if he couldn't be the natural talent everyone expected, he would become the hardest worker on the field. His fastballs gradually got stronger, his control slowly got sharper. And even though no one cheered when he practiced alone on late afternoons, Curt kept going, because he knew something many others didn't realize. Sometimes the difference between failure and legend is who is willing to endure longer. Yet, even as Curt began to improve, the road to the major leagues was still full of obstacles. He was traded, moved teams, called up and sent back down to lower levels. Each time felt like a reminder that his place in the baseball world was still fragile. Curt Schilling wasn't a name sports magazines wrote about. No fans waited for autographs after games. No big contracts. Just a young pitcher carrying a dream more and more people thought would never come true. And it was during that time that Curt Schilling began to understand a painful truth. The Major League Baseball dream might never arrive. But instead of giving up, he chose the opposite. If the world didn't believe he was good enough, he would keep throwing until they couldn't ignore him anymore. No one knew then that the boy doubted on empty minor league fields would one day step onto the mound in baseball's biggest games. No one knew that the pitcher many scouts once called not good enough for the major leagues would become one of the most memorable postseason warriors in history. But Curt Schilling didn't know that back then while riding those long bus rides through the minors. He only knew one thing. Tomorrow, he would step onto the mound again and throw one more time. When Curt Schilling finally reached Major League Baseball, it wasn't an explosive moment like in sports movies. No spotlight, no headline coverage, no feeling that a new legend had just arrived. In 1988, he made his MLB debut in a Baltimore Orioles uniform, a milestone any young baseball player dreams of. But for Curt Schilling, it was just the first step into a colder, harsher world than he had imagined. The Orioles didn't see him as the future of the team. He wasn't the ace pitcher, nor the talent commentators talked about on TV. In the locker room, Curt was just a name somewhere near the bottom of the roster. Reporters walked past him without a question. Fans didn't ask for autographs. Many in the stands didn't even know who he was. Curt Schilling had reached the major leagues, but he was still living in baseball's shadows. His appearances weren't frequent. Sometimes he was only called from the bullpen in games that were already decided. Sometimes he sat on the bench for many games straight without throwing a single pitch. For many young players, that's the scariest moment in a career, when the dream becomes real. But reality shows you're just a shadow in the world you once desperately wanted to enter. Not long after, Curt was traded to the Houston Astros. For big players, a trade can be an opportunity. But for a young pitcher who hadn't proven himself, a trade often felt like a reminder that the old team no longer believed in you. In Houston, the story wasn't much better. Curt still wasn't a name people noticed. He still had to fight for a chance to pitch. Still had to prove he deserved a spot in the lineup. There were games he pitched well, but then he was sent back to the bullpen. There were weeks he nearly disappeared from the field. Those years, Curt Schilling wasn't a rising star. He was a pitcher trying to survive. In the baseball world, doubt can weigh heavier than any injury. And Curt began feeling that weight every day. Scouts who had doubted him before still held their old opinions. Some coaches thought he lacked consistency. Others said he was just an average pitcher who could be replaced anytime. For Curt, the most painful thing wasn't the public criticism. It was the silent head shakes, the looks that said people had already decided he wasn't the future of the team. There were nights after games when Curt sat alone in nearly empty locker rooms. Cold metal chairs, the smell of leather gloves and sweat still in the air. He looked at his glove and asked himself a question many athletes dread. Maybe I'm not good enough. That was the scariest thought for someone who had spent his youth chasing the baseball dream. Because if the answer was yes, then all those years of practice, endless minor league bus rides, late evenings throwing alone after the field lights went out, it could all lead to a quiet end. A name vanishing from the roster. A career no one remembered. But Curt Schilling kept going. He kept throwing in early morning practices when the field was still wet with dew, kept staying in the bullpen after teammates had left, kept training with near-stubborn patience. Curt knew he didn't have an easy path. He wasn't the prodigy teams built around. He had only one choice: get better every day until no one could ignore him anymore. And even though the baseball world back then still saw him as an ordinary pitcher, Curt Schilling held the quiet belief in his heart that somewhere, sometime, there would be a day he stepped onto the mound no longer as a shadow. A day the whole stadium would know his name. But at that time, Curt Schilling couldn't see that day yet. He only knew that tomorrow he would step onto the mound again and throw one more time. When Curt Schilling left Houston and arrived with the Philadelphia Phillies in the early 1990s, few thought this would be the place that completely changed his life. In many people's eyes, Schilling was still just a pitcher traded multiple times, a name that had never truly proven himself in the major leagues. But Philadelphia at that time was a different city. This wasn't a place for soft stars or people who gave up easily. Phillies fans loved players who fought until the last drop of sweat, and it was in that tough place that Curt Schilling began to transform. At first, he was just a pitcher in the rotation, trying to hold his spot in the lineup. But game after game, people started seeing something different in the way he pitched. Schilling didn't just throw to finish the game. He threw like every pitch was a battle. His fastball became more ferocious. His eyes on the mound grew cold and focused to the point where many batters felt pressure before his first pitch even left his hand. Teammates began noticing it before the press did. Curt Schilling wasn't the most talented pitcher in the league, but he had something very few pitchers possessed: the ferocity of someone who never accepted defeat. Philadelphia gradually loved him for that, and when the 1993 season began, no one could have guessed that the Phillies, a team widely underrated, would embark on one of the strangest journeys in baseball history. The Phillies that year weren't a flashy team. They were a group of tough players, many of whom had been underrated just like Schilling. And in that lineup, Curt Schilling began to emerge as a true warrior on the mound. When they entered the 1993 National League Championship Series, the Phillies faced the Atlanta Braves, a team far superior on paper. But Schilling didn't care about those predictions. In Game 1 of the series, he took the mound with near-frightening focus, and he pitched one of the greatest games of his career. Complete control of the game, keeping the Braves almost helpless against his pitches. The Phillies won. But games like that never came easily. Schilling had pitched with a body that wasn't perfect. Shoulder pain started appearing. His arm grew heavy after long innings, but he didn't talk much about it. Because for Curt Schilling, pain wasn't a reason to stop. In the clubhouse, teammates began looking at him with special respect. This was no longer the pitcher doubted in Baltimore or Houston. This was a warrior they believed could take them far. And when the Phillies finally won the ALCS, Curt Schilling was awarded MVP of the series. That was the first moment in his career when the baseball world started paying attention. The name Curt Schilling finally appeared in major sports papers. But for Schilling, that victory was just one step on a longer road. The Phillies entered the 1993 World Series, hoping to bring the championship to Philadelphia. The city erupted with belief. Fans flooded the streets. The stadium shook every time the team took the field. And Curt Schilling kept pitching with everything he had. But the World Series is where dreams sometimes shatter in the cruelest ways. The Phillies faced the Toronto Blue Jays, a powerful team. Game after game, pressure mounted. And then the most painful moment came. Toronto won. The Phillies lost the World Series. In the clubhouse after the final game, there was no talking, no music, just the heavy silence of dreams that had just collapsed. Curt Schilling sat in the corner of the locker room, sweat still on his forehead, hands still marked by the resin. He had pitched brilliantly. He had fought like a warrior. But that still wasn't enough to win the championship. And in that moment, Schilling learned a painful lesson every great athlete must face in life. Getting very close to glory doesn't mean you'll touch it. Baseball can be that cruel. You can fight an entire season. You can pitch the best games of your life. But in the end, only one team lifts the trophy, and in 1993, it wasn't the Philadelphia Phillies. But if that failure broke many other players, for Curt Schilling, it did the opposite. It lit a deeper fire inside him, a fire the baseball world would witness many years later on an October night at Yankee Stadium, when his White Sox began to turn red. After the painful failure of the 1993 World Series, Curt Schilling's life continued with the familiar ups and downs of baseball. He still pitched well, still one of the most reliable pitchers in the rotation. But Philadelphia was no longer a team that could take him back to the top. Seasons passed, and Schilling gradually realized a truth every athlete must face. Chances to win a championship don't come many times in a career. And then, in 2000, a major turning point arrived. Curt Schilling was traded to the Arizona Diamondbacks. To many outsiders, this was just a routine trade, but for Schilling, it was a new chance, perhaps his last chance to touch the World Series trophy he had once come so close to but couldn't hold. The Diamondbacks at that time were a young team. They had no glorious history, no long tradition like the Yankees or Dodgers. But they had one special weapon. A tall man with long hair, a terrifying fastball, and cold eyes on the mound, Randy Johnson. When Curt Schilling first walked into the Diamondbacks clubhouse and saw Johnson there, he knew he was no longer fighting alone. Randy Johnson was already a legend, a pitcher nearly 7 feet tall with an arm that threw like a war machine. Batters across Major League Baseball feared facing him. And now, Curt Schilling stood on the same side as that man. Two pitchers with completely different career paths, but sharing one thing, an almost obsessive hunger to win. From their first season together, baseball started talking about a new duo, Randy Johnson and Curt Schilling. The press called them one of the strongest pitching pairs Major League Baseball had ever seen. Johnson brought terrifying power. Schilling brought precision and unrelenting will. When a team has two pitchers like that in the rotation, they don't just have an advantage. They have a weapon, but that strength didn't come without pressure. Because even with Johnson and Schilling, the whole baseball world knew one empire was dominating the league. The New York Yankees. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Yankees were nearly unbeatable. They had a star-studded lineup, deep playoff experience, and a history that intimidated every opponent. In many people's eyes, any team wanting to win the World Series had to go through New York, and most failed. When the 2001 season began, the Diamondbacks had a strong roster. But even then, many analysts didn't believe they could beat the Yankees. The press often mentioned Johnson and Schilling as two outstanding pitchers, but they also said baseball isn't just two people. You need the whole team. You need playoff experience. And above all, you need to overcome the New York Yankees. That doubt wasn't new to Curt Schilling. He had lived with skepticism his entire career, from scouts who said he wasn't good enough for the major leagues, to the years of trades and bench time early on. And now, once again, people were saying his team had no chance. But Curt Schilling didn't look at the articles. He looked at the mound, looked at Randy Johnson, and he knew that when the two of them took the field in a series, any team had to worry. In the 2001 season, Johnson and Schilling pitched like two storms. They threw hundreds of innings, striking out batter after batter. Whenever the Diamondbacks needed a win, one of them would take the mound. For opposing teams, that was a nightmare, because if they survived Randy Johnson today, tomorrow they faced Curt Schilling, and if they survived that, Johnson would be back. Gradually, something began to change. The Diamondbacks were no longer seen as the underdog. They started being viewed as a real contender, and in the Arizona clubhouse, Curt Schilling felt something he had been searching for all those years, a team that could fight alongside him. But as the season moved toward the final games, the pressure grew almost unbearable, because everyone knew the final question hadn't been answered yet. Could Randy Johnson and Curt Schilling beat the New York Yankees? Could these two great pitchers break baseball's strongest empire? Or would they become another story of a team that came so close, but still wasn't enough to defeat New York? Curt Schilling had once been so close to glory in 1993. He knew how painful that failure felt. And as the 2001 season headed to the World Series, he understood this might be his last chance. Not just for the Diamondbacks, but for himself, a pitcher who had fought his whole life, finally standing at baseball's biggest door. But on the other side of that door was the New York Yankees. The 2001 World Series began in an atmosphere the entire country had never experienced before. Just weeks after September 11th, the nation was still immersed in grief and loss. The New York Yankees at that time weren't just a baseball team. They became a symbol of New York City's resilience. A baseball dynasty that had dominated the late 1990s now carried the emotions of an entire nation on their backs. Derek Jeter, Mariano Rivera, Bernie Williams, names accustomed to World Series lights. They entered the series with the confidence of champions, and many believed the story of the 2001 season would end the way baseball was used to, the Yankees winning again. But on the other side, the Arizona Diamondbacks brought something different. Not history, not tradition. They brought the two most fearsome arms in the league, Randy Johnson and Curt Schilling. Right from Game 1 in Phoenix, Curt Schilling took the mound with his familiar cold stare. But behind that calm was a body already growing tired after a long season. His shoulder hurt, his arm felt heavy after hundreds of innings. But the World Series isn't a place to talk about fatigue. Schilling pitched like a man who knew this might be the biggest chance of his life. His fastball attacked the strike zone with ruthless precision. His slider cut through the air, throwing Yankees batters off timing. Arizona won Game 1, but the Yankees weren't a team that went down easily. In Game 3 in New York, Curt Schilling took the mound again. Yankee Stadium roared with tens of thousands of fans. The pressure here was different, the lights brighter, the screams louder, and the opponent more fearsome. Schilling pitched through each inning with absolute focus, but his body began to rebel. Shoulder pain intensified, arm grew heavier. That was the price of a long season and tense games. But Curt Schilling kept throwing, because he knew Randy Johnson was doing the same in other games. These two men were almost carrying the entire Diamondbacks on their shoulders. Game after game, Johnson and Schilling took turns on the mound. When one finished, the other prepared for the next. Little time to rest, little time to recover. Just pitches and World Series pressure. The series grew more tense as the Yankees began fighting back. Games in New York stretched into heart-stopping moments. Walk-off home runs, unbelievable mistakes. Cheers echoing through cold nights. There were times it seemed the Diamondbacks had lost their edge. But every time the Arizona team needed someone to stand up, Curt Schilling was there. By Game 7, the entire baseball world was watching. This wasn't just the final game of the World Series. It was the game deciding whether the Yankees' dynasty would continue. Randy Johnson pitched first. Then Schilling returned to the bullpen, ready if the team needed him. His body was nearly exhausted by then. But the adrenaline of Game 7 made every pain fade. The game unfolded like a movie no one dared write the script for. Yankees took the lead. Diamondbacks were backed into a corner. But in the final inning, Arizona started fighting back. Hit after hit. Heart-stopping base running. And then Luis Gonzalez hit a soft single through the infield. The ball dropped. The runner from third raced home. Diamondbacks won. The stadium erupted. Arizona players rushed from the dugout. Curt Schilling stood in the middle of that chaos, breathing hard, sweat and dirt on his face. After so many years fighting in baseball's shadows, he had finally become a World Series champion. And when the World Series MVP was announced, something unprecedented happened. Curt Schilling and Randy Johnson shared the award, two pitchers who had almost single-handedly carried their team to the championship. Two men who had fought inning by inning, but in that celebration moment, Curt Schilling understood something few thought about while lifting the trophy. Baseball doesn't let you stay at the top forever. The peak of sports is always fragile. One great season can vanish the next year. An arm can weaken. A team can fall apart. As Schilling stood in the stadium that night, cheers still ringing everywhere, he felt the joy he had chased his whole life. But deep down, he also knew a quiet truth. This peak wouldn't last forever, and baseball, like life, always finds a way to bring heroes back to earth. The 2001 World Series championship had lifted Curt Schilling to the absolute peak of baseball. He had defeated the New York Yankees dynasty, stood in the middle of a storm of celebration for a championship he once thought he might never touch. But in baseball, peaks rarely last. The following seasons passed, and then at the end of 2003, a new chapter began. Curt Schilling was traded to the Boston Red Sox. For many athletes, joining a big-market team is an honor. But Boston isn't like any other sports city. Boston doesn't just love baseball. Boston lives for baseball. And for nearly a century, this city had lived under an obsession called the Curse of the Bambino. The curse began in 1919 when the Red Sox sold legend Babe Ruth to the New York Yankees. From then on, the Yankees became baseball's most powerful empire. And Boston waited. Year after year, decade after decade, they came close to championships many times, but each time failed in the most painful ways. Fateful home runs, unbelievable errors. Losses in the final moments. 86 years passed without the Red Sox winning a World Series. When Curt Schilling arrived in Boston, he wasn't just joining a team. He was stepping into a city carrying historical pain. Boston fans no longer simply hoped. They were desperate. They were angry. They craved release from the curse that had haunted generations. In Boston, baseball isn't just a game. It's part of the city's identity, and every season ending in failure felt like a fresh wound carved into the collective memory of the fans. When Schilling arrived, the press immediately wrote that the Red Sox had brought in a World Series warrior. A pitcher who had beaten the Yankees. A man who knew how to win under the greatest pressure. But Curt Schilling also understood what that meant. Boston didn't just want him to pitch well, they wanted him to break the curse. Fenway Park, the Red Sox's historic stadium, has a special atmosphere. Old brick walls, the towering green monster in left field, and tens of thousands of fans packed close together, watching every pitch as if it were the defining moment of their lives. Curt Schilling stepped onto the Fenway mound for the first time and felt it immediately. The pressure here was different from anywhere he had pitched before. In Arizona, He was part of a young team writing new history. But in Boston, history weighed heavily on every player's shoulders. Every game carried memories of past failures. Every mistake was magnified by the fear that the curse was still there. Boston fans loved their team fiercely, but that love came with enormous expectations. And Curt Schilling entered the 2004 season knowing he wasn't just pitching for a team. He was pitching for a city desperate to be freed. Every time he took the mound, Fenway Park watched in silence. Every pitch carried the weight of 86 years of waiting. And as the season moved toward the playoffs, the pressure grew to almost unbearable levels. The Red Sox ultimately faced the New York Yankees again in the American League Championship Series. This wasn't just a playoff series. It was a clash between two teams carrying a century of history. Yankees, the winning empire. Red Sox, the team always so close but never quite reaching glory. Curt Schilling knew that if Boston wanted to break the curse, they had to beat the Yankees. But the Yankees were still as strong as a winning machine, and as the series began, everything seemed to follow the familiar path of history. The Red Sox started losing, then lost again. When the score reached 0-3, Fenway Park fell into heavy silence. No team in baseball history had ever come back from 0-3 to win a 7-game series. Boston fans saw the familiar nightmare, a great season, ending in pain again. And in that very moment of despair, Curt Schilling stepped into a challenge very few athletes in sports history have ever faced. Because his body at that point was beginning to break down, and just a few days later, the entire baseball world would witness an image they would never forget. The white sock beginning to turn red on the mound at Yankee Stadium. The 2004 American League Championship Series started like a familiar nightmare for the Boston Red Sox. Their opponent was none other than the New York Yankees, the greatest rival, the team that had tormented Boston for generations. And just days in, history seemed to be repeating itself once again. The Yankees won Game 1, then Game 2, then Game 3. When the score reached 0-3, Fenway Park fell into the heavy atmosphere Boston fans knew all too well. No team in Major League Baseball history had ever come back from 0-3 in a 7-game series. On paper, the Red Sox season was over, but what was worse for Curt Schilling was that his body was also breaking down. In Game 1, while covering first base, Schilling tore the tendon in his right ankle. It wasn't a minor injury. Every step sent sharp pain through his ankle like a knife. Team doctors examined the injury and gave a blunt verdict. One of the doctors looked at Schilling and said, "You can't pitch." The ankle tendon was torn, and any pressure on that foot could cause it to rupture completely. If that happened, not only would the series end, Curt Schilling's career could end right there too. For most athletes, the answer at that point would be simple: shut it down. But Curt Schilling wasn't like most athletes. When he heard the doctor say he couldn't pitch, he stayed quiet for a long moment. Then he answered with a sentence that later became legendary: "If we're going to lose, I want to lose fighting." The decision was made. An emergency surgery was performed. Doctors anchored Schilling's ankle tendon by suturing it to the bone to keep it stable. It wasn't a healing solution. It was just a temporary fix to prevent the tendon from tearing further for a few hours. When Curt Schilling left the operating room, the doctors told him straight that they didn't know if he could even stand on the mound. But a few days later, in Game 6 at Yankee Stadium, Curt Schilling walked out onto the field. More than 50,000 fans in the stands roared when he appeared, not because they were cheering for him. They were cheering for the Yankees. But they also knew something extraordinary was happening. Curt Schilling could barely walk normally coming out of the bullpen. But when he stood on the mound, he took a deep breath and prepared to throw his first pitch. The early innings passed in suffocating tension. Schilling pitched with absolute focus. But then the television cameras started noticing something strange. A small red streak appeared on his white sock. At first, just a spot. Then it spread. Blood began soaking through the sock. His torn ankle tendon was still bleeding under the bandages and sutures. The camera zoomed in on the sock, and within seconds the entire country saw the image. A pitcher throwing in the most important game of the season, with a white sock turning red. Every pitch from Curt Schilling at that moment was agony. When he rotated and shifted weight onto his right leg to throw, the ankle tendon stretched to the point of nearly unbearable pain, but he kept throwing. Fastball, slider, curveball, pitch after pitch. In a dugout, teammates watched him in awe. They knew he was in pain, but they also knew Schilling wouldn't leave the mound unless he couldn't stand anymore. Innings passed. Then more innings. The Yankees, one of baseball's most powerful offenses, started losing rhythm against his pitches. Curt Schilling pitched 7 innings, gave up only a few hits. When he left the mound, his sock was almost completely red. The Red Sox won that game. The series was now 3-3. And in that moment, Curt Schilling didn't just keep Boston alive for one more game. He created one of the most iconic images in American sports history. The bloody sock. The bloody sock. That image appeared on every major sports page the next day. On every television channel. For Boston fans, it wasn't just a win. It was a symbol of resilience, a man pitching through pain to keep hope alive for an entire city. And when the Red Sox stepped into Game 7 with completely transformed spirit, history began to shift. What no team had ever done, the Boston Red Sox were about to do. But on the night of Game 6, as Curt Schilling left Yankee Stadium with his blood-soaked sock, he wasn't thinking about history. He was thinking about only one thing: the battle wasn't over yet. The Game 6 victory with the bloody sock completely changed the atmosphere of the series. The Boston Red Sox, a team that had stood on the brink of elimination, suddenly became a team full of belief. In the clubhouse after the win at Yankee Stadium, Red Sox players looked at each other and started believing in something that had seemed unimaginable before. They were no longer playing just to survive. They started playing to make history. Game 7 of the American League Championship Series unfolded in suffocating tension. The Yankees were still baseball's empire. But for the first time in the series, they no longer controlled the game. The Red Sox took the field with the confidence of a team that had just escaped death. Hit after hit, pitch after pitch, carried the energy of a rebellion. When the game ended and the scoreboard confirmed the win for Boston, the impossible finally happened. The Red Sox had come back from 0-3 to win 4-3. For the first time in Major League Baseball history, a team had done it. And the victim of the greatest comeback in history was the New York Yankees. But Boston's journey wasn't over yet. After the ALCS, the Red Sox advanced to the World Series against the St. Louis Cardinals, the team with the best record in the National League that year. The Cardinals were considered very strong, with a dangerous offense and deep playoff experience. But after the life-or-death battle with the Yankees, the Red Sox entered the World Series with a completely different mindset. For them, there was no pressure greater than what they had just overcome. And what happened next stunned the entire baseball world. The Boston Red Sox swept the St. Louis Cardinals in 4 straight games, 4-0. No decisive Game 7. No drawn-out drama. Just a team playing with absolute confidence. When the final out of Game 4 was recorded at Busch Stadium, history officially changed. The Boston Red Sox became the 2004 World Series champions, their first championship in 86 years. The curse of the Bambino was finally broken. In the minutes that followed, Boston exploded. Hundreds of thousands poured into the streets. The streets around Fenway Park turned into a sea of people. Fans hugged, cried, laughed, and shouted in joy that generations before them had never experienced. There were elderly people who had waited their entire lives to see this moment. there were three-generation families standing together, remembering loved ones who had passed away without witnessing the Red Sox win. And at the center of that story was Curt Schilling, the pitcher who had thrown with a blood-soaked sock just days earlier. The image of the bloody sock had become an immortal symbol in American sports. It wasn't just a moment in baseball. It was a symbol of will, of resilience, of a man willing to pitch through pain to keep hope alive for an entire city. Curt Schilling wasn't the only one who contributed to that championship, but his moment became the soul of the entire comeback. After the World Series, sports media across America called him one of the greatest postseason warriors in history. For Boston fans, he wasn't just a pitcher. He was part of the legend. But behind the celebration lights and victory parades, another truth began to emerge. Curt Schilling's body was starting to pay the price for all the battles he had fought on the mound. His ankle never fully recovered after the emergency surgery in 2004. The lingering pain became a constant part of his life. Every subsequent season, Schilling pitched with increasingly serious injuries: shoulder pain, back pain, ankle weakness. The man who once pitched through blood and agony to break an 86-year curse was beginning to realize the human body has limits, and the price of legend is sometimes paid with the very health of the person who creates it. After the 24 World Series championship, Curt Schilling entered the final phase of his career with a completely different status. He was no longer the doubted pitcher from his early years. He had become one of the most respected names in postseason baseball. But behind that reputation, his body began sending signals no athlete wants to hear. In the years after 2004, Curt Schilling began living with near-constant pain. His shoulder, the most important part for a pitcher, started weakening after thousands of throws throughout his career. Every time he swung his arm for a fastball, a tight feeling spread from shoulder to elbow. Doctors advised him to reduce his workload. But Curt Schilling had never been one to stop easily. The ankle that had been surgically repaired in the 2004 ALCS never truly returned to normal. Cold Boston days made the joint ache sharply. There were mornings he needed nearly an hour just to warm up his body enough to walk downstairs. And then his back became the next problem. The powerful twisting motions in his pitching delivery, the same ones that had made him a power pitcher, now began putting tremendous pressure on his spine. For an ordinary athlete, injuries like that would be a sign to retire. But Curt Schilling kept pitching. Not because he didn't feel the pain. He felt it every day, but because baseball was still what had defined his life. Throughout the 2005 and 2006 seasons, Schilling remained an important part of the Boston Red Sox rotation. However, he began to realize a truth every athlete eventually faces. Time was winning. Games that once came easily now felt harder. Recovery after each start took more days. Pitches that once reached top velocity no longer had the same power. And though experience kept him effective, he knew his body was approaching its limit. But Curt Schilling still had one final chapter before leaving the mound. The 2007 season saw the Boston Red Sox return with a strong roster. It was a balanced team with solid pitching and a dangerous lineup. Schilling was now 40 years old, an age when many pitchers had long retired. But he still took the mound, no longer with the explosiveness of youth, but with the resilience of a battle-hardened warrior. In that year's postseason, the Red Sox went deep once again, and then they entered the World Series against the Colorado Rockies. For Curt Schilling, it was an emotional moment. 3 years earlier, he had helped Boston break the 86-year curse. Now he had a chance for one more championship. The Red Sox won the 2007 World Series by sweeping the Rockies 4-0. It was the third World Series ring of Curt Schilling's career, a near-perfect ending for a pitcher who had been through so many battles. But even in that moment of victory, Schilling understood that his time on the mound was gradually ending. His body no longer allowed him to compete at baseball's highest level. After the 2007 season, shoulder injuries grew more severe. Recovery efforts stretched over many months, but the results weren't the same. And then Curt Schilling faced the hardest decision any athlete must make. In 2009, he officially announced his retirement from Major League Baseball. No grand farewell, no dramatic final game. Just a quiet statement that his journey on the mound had ended. Curt Schilling left baseball with more than 3,000 strikeouts, 3 World Series championships, and a solid legacy in postseason history. But for him personally, the hardest part wasn't leaving the field. It was learning how to live in a life without baseball. And that was only the beginning of other challenges he never imagined he would have to face. After leaving the Major League Baseball mound, Curt Schilling stepped into a completely new phase of his life. For more than 2 decades, his life had been defined by one thing: baseball, the season schedule, cross-country flights, tense nights under stadium lights. But when his career ended, that void appeared. Many athletes choose a quieter path after retirement, becoming broadcasters, coaches, or simply enjoying life after years of competition. But Curt Schilling had never been one to live safely. He was always drawn to big challenges. And this time, the challenge wasn't on the field, but in the world of technology and creation. Schilling had long had a special passion for video games. Throughout his MLB career, he often carried a laptop on long flights just to play games and explore new game projects. For him, it wasn't just entertainment. It was a world full of creative potential. After retiring, he decided to turn that passion into a big dream. In 2006, Curt Schilling founded a game development company called 38 Studios. The name 38 wasn't random. It was his legendary jersey number throughout his baseball career. For Schilling, this project wasn't just a business. It was like a new chapter in his life, a chance to prove he could succeed in a completely different field. Schilling invested tens of millions of his own dollars into the company. He hired famous game designers, screenwriters, top artists in the industry. The company moved its headquarters to Rhode Island after receiving a large financial incentive from the state government, with hopes of creating hundreds of jobs and turning the area into a new game industry hub. In the early years, everything seemed to be on track. In 2012, 38 Studios released its first title, Kingdoms of Amalur: Reckoning. The game received many positive reviews from critics. Players praised its combat system and vast fantasy world. For Curt Schilling, it was a moment of great pride. After years of investment, the dream was finally starting to become real. But behind that glow was a dangerous truth. Game development costs were enormous. The company's next project, a massive online game, consumed huge amounts of money before the first product had time to recoup. Debts began piling up. Investor meetings grew more tense, and then in 2012, the nightmare happened. 38 Studios officially declared bankruptcy. The company shut down. Hundreds of employees lost their jobs in a single day. The state of Rhode Island's financial support became a major political scandal. And Curt Schilling, the company's founder, became the center of every criticism. In the media's eyes, the story was told very simply. A former sports star tried to become a businessman and failed spectacularly. Newspapers ran cold headlines: Schilling's $75 million disaster, from World Series hero to business failure, a naive athlete who tried to play CEO. For Curt Schilling, those criticisms hurt more than any fastball he ever faced on the mound, because this time, there were no teammates beside him, no fans cheering, no next game to step into and fix the mistakes. He didn't just lose the company, he lost nearly all the wealth he had accumulated throughout his baseball career. The years of playing, the big contracts, the savings. Almost everything vanished in the collapse of 38 Studios. Many said Curt Schilling had been too naive, that he didn't understand the business world. But those who knew him saw a different story. They saw a man who always believed in big dreams, a man willing to bet everything on what he believed in. And when that dream collapsed, Curt Schilling once again faced a familiar reality in his life. Starting over from zero, after all the glorious years of baseball, after historic moments like the bloody sock in 2004, Curt Schilling stood before life again like a man who had to rebuild everything from nothing. But if the history of his life has proven anything, it's one simple truth. Curt Schilling can be knocked down. But he has never been one to stay on the ground. After the collapse of 38 studios, Curt Schilling faced one of the most difficult periods of his life. In the public's eyes, he was no longer the World Series hero with the bloody sock from 2004. Many newspapers began using harsher words: failed businessman, naive sports star, the man who lost his entire fortune chasing a dream that was too big. But while Schilling was still trying to rebuild his life after that financial disaster, a new challenge suddenly appeared. And this time, it was more dangerous than any business failure. In 2014, Curt Schilling publicly shared news that stunned many baseball fans. He had been diagnosed with mouth cancer. This wasn't a sports injury that could heal with surgery and rehab. It was a disease that could take a person's life. Doctors said the cause was very likely linked to a habit that had existed for decades in baseball culture: chewing tobacco. Throughout his career, like so many other players, Curt Schilling had used chewing tobacco in the dugout and on the field. For many baseball players back then, it was almost part of the competitive culture. But after many years, that habit could leave serious consequences. When doctors delivered the diagnosis, Curt Schilling understood he was stepping into a completely different battle. No mound, no strike zone, no cheering crowd, just him, the disease, and a treatment journey full of uncertainty. He began treatment almost immediately. Constant medical checks, long rounds of radiation, days when his body was so exhausted that just getting out of bed became a challenge. In later interviews, Schilling admitted that this period forced him to face his greatest fear in life: not the fear of failure, not the fear of losing money, but the fear of not having enough time left with his family. Throughout his life, Curt Schilling had been used to fighting. He had once pitched with a torn ankle tendon in front of millions of viewers. He had faced baseball's strongest hitters in decisive World Series games. But cancer was a different opponent. You couldn't see it on the scoreboard. You couldn't defeat it with willpower in a single night of competition. It was a battle that stretched day after day, week after week, month after month. People close to Schilling said that during treatment, he became much quieter. The man, once known for his strong, outspoken personality, began spending more time with his family, his wife, and his children. Quiet evenings at home became more precious than any stadium lights he had ever experienced. And once again, Curt Schilling approached this challenge the way he had always approached every battle in his life. He didn't run from it. He faced it. He openly shared his story to warn young players about the dangers of chewing tobacco. He said plainly that if he could go back in time, he would never touch it. His message wasn't just for baseball. It was for anyone taking their health lightly. The treatment lasted many months. There were good days, there were bad days. But gradually, the news started turning more positive. Doctors confirmed the treatment was working. The disease was under control. And finally, Curt Schilling announced that he had beaten the cancer. To many, it was just a line in the news. But to Curt Schilling, it was another victory, perhaps the most important victory of his life. No championship trophy, no victory parade, but something more valuable than anything: the chance to keep living, the chance to keep seeing his family, the chance to keep telling the story of a man who spent his entire life fighting on the field, in business, and ultimately in the battle for his own survival. After overcoming cancer, Curt Schilling seemed to step into a calmer chapter of his life. He no longer had to fight pain on the mound, nor carry the enormous financial burden that followed the collapse of 38 studios. Instead, he began a new role in the baseball world, analyst. In 2010, Schilling joined ESPN as a baseball analyst. For many fans, it was a perfect fit. Curt Schilling wasn't just a great former pitcher. He had deep knowledge of strategy, game psychology, and the most intense moments of postseason play. On television programs, Schilling broke down every pitch, every pitching change, every managerial decision with the same clarity and directness as his playing style. Many viewers liked his straightforward, no-nonsense approach. He didn't try to please everyone, but that very directness gradually led him into another dangerous territory, the world of politics and public controversy. In the years after retirement, Curt Schilling increasingly expressed strong political opinions on social media. He wasn't afraid to speak his mind on social, cultural, and political issues in America. For some, it was a citizen's right to free speech. But for many others, especially in the sports media environment, those statements became the source of fierce debates. Schilling's social media posts often sparked strong reactions. Some supported him for his honesty, but many others criticized him harshly. And by 2016, the relationship between Curt Schilling and ESPN came to an end. After a series of controversial statements on social media, ESPN decided to fire him. The announcement was brief, but its impact was huge. Once again, Curt Schilling became the center of a media storm. Many said he had destroyed his own broadcasting career. Others said he was just speaking what he believed. And from that point on, Curt Schilling became one of the most polarizing figures in modern baseball history. But the biggest controversy surrounding his legacy wasn't about broadcasting or politics. It was about a place sacred to every baseball player, the Hall of Fame. The National Baseball Hall of Fame is where the greatest legends in Major League Baseball history are honored. Each year, sports writers vote to decide who gets inducted in Cooperstown, and Curt Schilling almost immediately became one of the most controversial candidates in the voting process. On stats and achievements alone, his resume was strong. More than 3,000 strikeouts, 3 World Series championships, one of the best strikeout-to-walk ratios in Major League Baseball history. But what made Curt Schilling so special was his postseason record. In the biggest games, under the greatest pressure, he often performed at his best. World Series 2001, the 2004 ALCS with the Bloody Sock, World Series 2007. Those moments had etched his name into baseball history. Many analysts called him one of the greatest postseason pitchers of all time. But every year when Hall of Fame voting came around, the question always returned: should Curt Schilling's legacy be judged only on baseball, or should off-field controversies also be considered? Year after year, Schilling came very close to the 75% threshold needed for induction. Some years he missed by just a few percentage points. But he was never elected. Debates erupted everywhere in the baseball community. Some said the Hall of Fame should judge only on-field performance. Others said character and off-field behavior matter too. Curt Schilling understood that clearly, and in a notable decision, he even once asked the Hall of Fame to remove his name from the ballot after years of controversy. For him, the debate seemed to never end. But regardless of anyone's viewpoint, one thing almost everyone who understands baseball agrees on: Curt Schilling was a special pitcher, a warrior of the biggest games. A man who once stepped onto the mound with a stitched ankle tendon and pitched through pain to keep hope alive for an entire city. He may be a controversial figure, but when it comes to postseason baseball, history will always remember Curt Schilling as one of the greatest pitchers to ever take the mound. And that is a truth even his critics find hard to deny. When he reached 59 years old, Curt Schilling no longer stood on the mound. No more roar of tens of thousands in stadiums. No more autumn nights where World Series lights illuminated every pitch. His life now is much quieter. No more packed schedules, no more cross-country flights, no more games where every throw could change history. But even though the stadium lights have long gone out, Curt Schilling's legacy still lives in baseball's memory. In the history of this sport, there are many talented pitchers. Those who threw faster, those with better stats, those who won more awards. But very few are remembered for how they fought, like Curt Schilling. Because if you had to choose one image to represent his entire career, people usually don't mention strikeout numbers, ERA, or long stat lines. They remember the bloody sock, October 2004, Yankee Stadium. A pitcher steps onto the mound with a tendon freshly stitched. Every step is agony. Every pitch is a test of his body. And when the camera zooms in on the white sock, people see blood spreading. That image wasn't just a moment in baseball, it became a symbol of resilience, a symbol that a human can push through pain to fight for what they believe in. But looking back at Curt Schilling's entire life, the bloody sock is only a small part of a much larger story. His life wasn't a perfect tale. It wasn't a straight path from one victory to another. Instead, it was full of painful turns. He was once a boy, raised in a family heavily influenced by war. A strict father, a childhood where emotions were rarely expressed. He was once a young pitcher no one believed in, going through small fields and long minor league bus rides before getting a chance in Major League Baseball. He went through seasons where people doubted whether he was good enough to survive in the majors, and then when his career reached its peak, when he became a World Series and postseason hero, life kept throwing new challenges at him. Injuries, a body slowly weakening after thousands of pitches. The business dream, with 38 studios, collapsed, taking nearly all the wealth he had built through his playing career. Mouth cancer, a disease that could have taken his life, appeared as a cruel reminder that even the strongest athletes can't control everything. And then the controversies, debates about his personal views. Years when Curt Schilling's name became a divisive topic in the baseball community. Some people supported him, some criticized him, some believed he deserved a spot in the Hall of Fame, and some didn't agree. But if you set aside all those controversies, if you look at just one thing, how Curt Schilling faced his life, a clear picture emerges. This is the story of a man who never gave up. When he was doubted in his early career, he kept throwing. When the Phillies lost the 1993 World Series, he kept fighting. When the Diamondbacks were underrated against the Yankees in 2001, he stepped onto the mound and helped write one of baseball's greatest victories. When the Boston Red Sox stood on the brink of defeat in 2004, he pitched with a bloody sock to keep hope alive for an entire city. When his company went bankrupt, he got back up and started over. When doctors said he had cancer, he fought the disease like another game. That is why Curt Schilling isn't just a pitcher in baseball history. He is a symbol of a spirit Americans often call by one simple word: fighter, a warrior. And perhaps that is Curt Schilling's true legacy. Not just the World Series rings, not just the legendary postseason games, but the way he stepped onto the mound of life, time after time, even when his body hurt, even when he failed, even when the whole world doubted him. Some legends are remembered for the victories they achieved, but Curt Schilling will always be remembered for how he fought to achieve them. And sometimes in sports, as in life, that is the greatest victory of all. Looking back at Curt Schilling's entire story, it's hard to see him only as a great baseball pitcher. His story feels like a painful summary of the American dream itself, where glory and tragedy often walk side by side. We remember him through the moment of the bloody sock in 2004, when he stepped onto the mound at Yankee Stadium with a freshly stitched ankle tendon, blood soaking through his white sock, yet still pitching to keep hope alive for the Boston Red Sox. That wasn't just a sports moment. It became an image symbolizing the endurance and sacrifice Americans have always honored. But behind that legendary moment is a life tested many times. Schilling once stood at the peak with 3 World Series championships, but after retirement he lost nearly all his fortune when 38 studios collapsed in 2012. A man who once earned tens of millions from baseball faced bankruptcy. Then, mouth cancer appeared, the consequence of the chewing tobacco habit common in baseball culture, forcing him into a true battle for survival. Even after recovering, he became a controversial figure, fired from ESPN and repeatedly falling short of Hall of Fame induction despite having one of the greatest postseason records in history. These details make Curt Schilling's story both tragic and admirable. He isn't a perfect legend, but he is a human who kept getting back up after every fall. For Americans, the lesson from this story is clear. Success isn't measured by never falling down, but by continuing to stand up every time life knocks you down. Curt Schilling may not be loved by everyone, but his fighting spirit from the World Series mound to cancer treatment is something any society should cherish. If Curt Schilling's story and his never-give-up fighting spirit have touched you, hit subscribe so we can keep exploring the inspiring journeys of sports legends and the lives behind the stadium lights. Thank you for watching to the end, and see you in the next video where we'll dive into more stories that make the whole country reflect.